Hello, and welcome to the Third Sector podcast. I'm Emily Harle.
And I'm Lucinda Rouse. Each week we bring you half an hour of discussion and debate about the important goings-on in the charity world. This week is a little different. Our guest is not from the charity sector, but her line of work does have parallels with some important charity management and governance functions. Chloe Hadjimatheou is an investigative journalist and narrative editor at the Observer newspaper. She previously spent almost 18 years working at the BBC and joins us today from the Observer's office. Hi, Chloe.
Hi there.
Now, you were the journalist behind one of the top investigative stories of 2025. It centred on a best-selling book, The Salt Path, which was published in 2018 as a non-fiction memoir of a couple's 630-mile journey walking the southwest coast path. And the story went that they began their journey after losing their money and their home back in 2013. And if that wasn't bad enough, the husband had just been diagnosed with a terminal neurodegenerative condition. But as your work has revealed, all was not as it seemed. Your investigation came out in the summer of 2025, shortly after a film based on the book was released. Could you please tell us in a nutshell about your investigation and what it uncovered?
So at the beginning of 2025, in the early months of 2025, I got a tip-off from a member of the public who essentially said that they had met Raina and Moth and got to know them. And they were concerned that Moth was not representing his condition honestly. And what Raina had written in her books was not an honest representation of Moth's condition. And they suggested that I look a bit deeper into the couple and the stories that they were publishing. And they were able to furnish me with two pieces of information. The fact that this couple were not using their real names were nowhere to be found in public. They offered me their real names and they offered me the name of the town in Wales where they had lost their home. That was also not public. I had never read the book. I wasn't sure whether this was a big deal. I'm not an arts reporter, so it took a little bit of digging for me to realise that Raina Wynne is a literary superstar. She sold over 2 million copies of her book. All three of her books, The Salt Path and its sequels, have topped the Times bestseller list. And a movie was made, as you said, of their life story. And so I started to dig and I went to Wales. And what I found was that the origin story in The Salt Path, which sets out their entire kind of ethos behind the books, which is that this is a couple who have been beset by terrible luck. They are victims of fate in a way. First of all, they are conned out of their home by somebody that they trusted. And then within a week, Moth is diagnosed with corticobasal degeneration, an extremely rare, but really quite brutal neurological condition in the same family as Parkinson's, but far, far worse. And rather than being sort of knocked sideways by these revelations, they decide to walk the southwest coastal path. Well, I found that the reason they actually lost their house was because in 2008, Raina Wynne, or Sally Walker, as is her real name and as she was known back then, was working as a part-time bookkeeper for an estate agent in Porthelly, the town in Wales, North Wales, where they lived. And she was accused of stealing over £60,000 from her employer. She was arrested, her house was searched, and after a day of questioning, the police let her go and asked her to reappear the next day. She fled, went down to London to a rich relative of her husband's and borrowed £100,000. She borrowed that money against her home and she used it to pay back the missing money from her employer and to cover legal costs on both sides on a no admissions basis, and also asking her former employer to sign a non-disclosure that he would never speak about the incident again. So she was never charged, but now she had this massive debt against her home alongside a normal bank mortgage that she had. The loan was not repaid and the courts repossessed their home. So it's a very different picture from this sort of image of these innocent victims who have been conned. I then began looking into Moth's condition. And, you know, as an investigative journalist, you have to become an expert in something very, very quickly. And I spoke to a lot of neurologists that specialize in this. They told me that this condition is always fatal. It normally kills people within about 8 years. One person told me that they did know of somebody who survived 12 years, but they were in a very, very poor state of health, completely dependent at the end of their lives. And of course, when you see moth, and there is a video from the beginning of 2025 that was put out by a charity called the PSPA, the only charity that represents people with this condition, he doesn't have any obvious visible symptoms from this condition. And so it was curious to me. He claims to have had the condition for 18 years. He was diagnosed, they say, in 2013, but had already had symptoms for 6 years then. I spoke to people with the condition and they said to me, you can't walk. Like, this is part of the condition, is the inability to walk long distances. You also suffer from, immense exhaustion. And so this idea that he walked the Southwest Coastal Path, but not only that, core to all three of Raina Wynn's books is a kind of secular miracle that happens. In walking the Southwest Coastal Path, Moth's health is restored. I said to one doctor, how do you know that, walking the Southwest Coastal Path wouldn't help somebody? Could you do medical trials? And he said, no, we wouldn't be able to get it past the ethics board because people would be suffering so horrendously. You couldn't possibly make people do this. They just can't walk.
Yeah, and there was also a charity dragged into this. As you mentioned, the PSPA is a charity that supports people with this very rare and widely unknown condition. The Wynns, or at least Moth, had been acting as fundraiser and ambassador of sorts for the charity, hadn't they?
So yes, so the PSPA are the first place that I went to when I wanted to learn about corticobasal degeneration. They're the only charity that represents people with this very rare condition. And everybody that I've spoken to says they're an absolutely excellent charity. They do an incredible job of supporting people with this condition. Of course, as far as the PSPA are concerned, having a celebrity like Raina Wynn and Moth speaking about something that is so rare, a condition that has so little public knowledge, it's an incredible opportunity for this charity to be able to get the word out about this condition. And I think if you speak to anyone who either has had a relative, has been nursing somebody with CBD, or has been diagnosed themselves, it's impossible for them not to have heard about the SALT path because it is something that's immediately connected with this condition. So Moth became a sort of ambassador, and Raina Wynn has also published articles on their website. And her article on the website is very strange because it contradicts her books in terms of dates about Moth's diagnosis. And Moth's video talks about his illness, but doesn't talk about the secular miracle. And my understanding is, at least the person that I was in contact with the PSPA, was unaware of how much this secular miracle was a feature of the books. And I don't know who within the PSPA was aware of how massive these claims were of reversing the condition.
But they did act very quickly after your investigation came out to distance themselves from Moth and Raina Wynn. Your story came out on the Saturday in the summer, and by Monday they had issued a statement saying that they terminated the relationship with them because too many questions currently remain unanswered. You were interviewed shortly after it came out by another publication in which you said that the story took so long to come to light because it has been, 7-8 years since their book was published, because nobody had asked the right questions before. And I think that's a really pertinent point when we're thinking about the charity context and when we're thinking about questions that trustees, that leaders of charities need to be asking before they bring on a prominent personality who could raise awareness for their cause. And I wonder if you have any thoughts from your perspective as an investigative journalist on how you make sure that you are asking the right questions about somebody when you perhaps don't know everything about them.
I think it's really, really difficult. I have to say, I don't envy people in that position, particularly when it comes to a health condition. There is such sensitivity around people's health and privacy for very, very good reasons. To ask to see somebody's medical records would be quite an intrusive thing to ask for, I think. And so I'm not really sure what to say about that. Even for me as an investigative journalist, looking into somebody's health claims, it was an incredibly uncomfortable thing to do. And today I would sit here and say, I cannot prove categorically that Moth does not have corticobasal degeneration because I'm not privy to his medical records. So I cannot categorically prove that. What I can say is that his condition, as he has publicly described it, does not tally with anything that doctors I have spoken to have ever witnessed. I can't say more than that. And I think if somebody wants to court a celebrity to their charity to help bring awareness to a subject, it would be very, very difficult to start saying, well, can you prove how sick you are? What I would say is when there are claims that sort of stand out, that are beyond the norm, that are somehow surprising or buck the trend in some way, I think that is where you can start having a look and asking some questions. So not to have said, hey, Moth, can you prove you've got corticobasal degeneration? But this is a massive claim that you were making, suggesting that your condition was reversed by walking. Why don't we go and speak to a neurologist who specializes in this? We must have lots who we're in contact with as this charity. Let's just check. Has anything been published about this? As a doctor, if this was your patient, you would immediately go and publish. If there had been some kind of miraculous discovery that this kind of exercise had a huge impact on corticobasal degeneration that nobody else knew about, it would be beholden on you to publish something, given the fact that there are people out there who are sick who have no treatment at all. And so you'd want to have a look around and speak to some medical experts and say, how does this sit with you? And if they said, look, this just doesn't make any sense, then you could go back and say, look, we've spoken to some specialists who are curious about your recovery. Would you be able to give us more proof of that, some evidence of that? Could we speak to your doctor about how that happened? Because it's important for us as a charity. We may be approached by sick people who want to know more about it. And I think you could do it from a perspective of curiosity rather than accusation or finger pointing. But I think from the moment that there are huge claims being made that are surprising or shocking, that is a place where you can start to dig in and ask questions, I think.
You've spoken to a lot of people who have CBD, and a lot of those people will have been reading The Salt Path with a lot of optimism, and it reignited hope in some people because of this miraculous sort of recovery that Moth alleged. But there's a real concern there from a charity perspective about potential misinformation. There is already so much information available online and across social media specifically, and particularly with the rise of AI at the moment, around health conditions. Health charities are very much affected by this and are constantly having to fight misinformation from all sides at the moment. I'm curious to hear a bit more about how the people that you spoke with who have this condition, how they were affected by reading The Salt Path and then by later reading your investigation and what you found.
So the day after I published, I was contacted by somebody called John. His message, I have to say, absolutely floored me. I was so sort of taken aback emotionally by it. It said, Chloe, my name is John. I have CBD and I read The Salt Path and felt that Moth's journey mirrored my own. And I was given a lot of hope. Reading your investigation, that hope has now been extinguished. I can live with it, but I'm not sure my wife can. And it was so upsetting to me to read that, because I knew in a sort of vague way that people may have been affected by this, but actually hearing from somebody like that who had hope opened where there shouldn't have been hope in that way, and then had it extinguished, it was so upsetting. I've been down and visited John several times now and spoken to him a great deal. And he's a very pragmatic man. And so when he was told by his doctor in very stark terms, his doctor was extremely blunt with him and said, do not try and fight this. There is no fighting it. I have seen it take people in exactly the same way, time and time again. It follows a very specific pattern and it always plays out the same. And this is what will happen to you. And he was really clear with John. And John, at the time, was obviously shocked, But he really appreciated knowing the truth, because what that then does is that however much that is a blow, it then explains to you how precious time is at that point. And you have this limited amount of time before your deterioration in health closes that window on you. So you have to choose how to spend that time. And if you give somebody false hope and you allow them to believe that potentially they could live 18 years as well as Moth is, as healthy as Moth is, you then potentially rob them from using the little time they have left to do what is incredibly important to them. And if they don't get to do those things and that window closes, that's an incredibly devastating thing. And so I think that really is the risk. And not only that, the majority of people who've contacted me are people who are family members who have nursed people through CBD and have had loved ones who've died of CBD. And they have said the same thing again and again, that they felt gaslit by the salt path, that essentially the salt path said to them, had you forced your loved one into walking the coastal path, perhaps they would still be alive and well. They say they feel relieved knowing the truth because they felt that they were going crazy in a way reading these books. I think the public interest in the investigation falls very heavily on the fact that people have been misled, and vulnerable people, because when you have a terminal diagnosis, there's desperation for you to try and cling on to any semblance of hope that you can find. And so Raina Wynn says she has never tried to give medical advice. She has never claimed that walking is a cure for corticobasal degeneration. She's merely expressed the journey that she and her husband have gone on. But I'm not completely convinced by that argument, because in her books, she tries to find medical studies that backs the idea that Moth has reversed his symptoms. She discusses that there may be evidence for this. And I think it's also naive to think that somebody will read that in a moment of desperation and not cling to the hope that it offers.
I'd like to move away from the intricacies around the diagnosis and the effect that it's had on people who are also living with the condition, and think about what is in your investigative journalist toolkit that could also be used by people working for charities who are wanting to undertake due diligence on potential ambassadors or even potential beneficiaries, people who are claiming funds from a charity and so on. You mentioned that you received a tip-off from a whistleblower, and then that was essentially the start of your investigation. Could you tell us a little bit about some of the methods that you used to uncover this story and get to the truth?
Sure. I mean, I think it's really hard to expect. I mean, lots of people have said, for example, about the publishing industry, why they didn't do more checks and balances. I think it's unrealistic to expect people either in charities or in the publishing industry, for example, to be investigative journalists. But I mean, so the work that I've done is really sort of nut and bolt journalism. I spent time with the land registry, going through documents, looking at what had happened to this couple's house. So publicly available documents, that's a good place to start. But I would say always, the real starting point is with the individual themselves. So if you have somebody who is associated with your charity, starting to dig in the background about them without informing them, I suggest may not be a good move, because people will often twig to the fact that you're digging into them. And it could look really sort of malicious if they're not aware of it. So the first thing that I did when I got my tip off actually was to contact Raina and Moth and say, look, I'm interested in this miraculous recovery. Can I interview you about it? And when it became clear they wouldn't give me an interview, I said to them, I know medical records are private, but given the sort of huge claims that are being made here, would you consider allowing me to see them so then I can publish about the fact that this really is a miracle? And they stopped responding to me at that point. But at that point, at least I had tried. What you don't want is to go and dig into somebody's health, for example, when they could just quite easily have produced a document and given it to you. So I would suggest the first place is with the individual themselves. If you have any concerns, if you have any questions, I would just approach the individual and say, look, something has come to our attention that's calling into question this. We would love to talk to you about it. Can you explain it? Can you give us some evidence? Whatever it is that you need. Then if that doesn't go as planned and you feel that you need to dig further, then I would suggest public bodies like the Land Registry, like birth and death records. There are lots and lots of places where you can start to look at stuff. Experts are also a great place. So for me, in my particular case, I spent a lot of time trying to understand the condition and speaking to experts. And then there's just lots of for me, I was doing things like trying to understand who this couple were in Wales. I spent time going and door knocking and sort of trying to find the estate agent where Raina Wynn had originally worked. I went into all the estate agents in this town and spoke to people and eventually got the number of someone. I went through her descriptions of the places she stopped on the Southwest Coastal Path and tried to match them on maps with real places and individuals and called around. So it was very much that kind of time-consuming, really quite boring investigative work, which, investigations sound very glamorous, but the truth is a lot of the work is tedious and boring and time-consuming.
Chloe, you broke this original story in July 2025. Then just last month in December, you had a Sky News documentary coming out. I understand that you have another podcast series on the Salt Path coming out in the very near future.
That's right. January the 13th, there will be a podcast series which will go into the whole story in far more granular detail, a narrative multi-part podcast series on The Observer.
Brilliant. We watch this space. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us about your investigation and give us a few tips about things that people can do when they have questions that need answering. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion with Chloe, and that's it for this episode. From Emily and me and all of us at Third Sector, thank you so much for listening. Our producers are Jude Owen and Nav Powell.